Greetings, sir. How are you doing?
Just a minute. I'm doing good. Had an interesting chat with my doctor.
I was going to say, what did the man in the white coat say?
Well, it was a female.
Okay. What did the woman in the white coat say?
Well, I mean, she told me what she had to tell me from her doctor's point of view, but there's always this edge that I've been working with. That's fine. I respect your knowledge, but I've been living in this body for a long time, and I'm not rushing. I don't want to rush into insulin. Yeah,
I agree.
And she was just adamant that I needed to be on it, and I understand her concern.
Mm-hmm.
But she just had this habit of repeating her concern, and I didn't feel like I was being listened to.
Okay.
But eventually we kind of worked it out.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it just she's a new doctor, and I've had to change doctors a couple of times when I embrace this inability of certain doctors not to consider listening to the patient.
Yeah.
You know, I have all the utmost respect for their training and stuff, but you know, this is a bad way of putting it. You're like a mechanic that has knowledge, and you have to tell me what's my what are my options.
Yeah. You need a new air filter, buddy. I'm telling you. Okay.
Yeah, and is there's cost? I mean, how are we working with this? Because bottom line is, some of it is money, and some of it is I just don't want to rush down what they're promoting necessarily.
No, I agree. Our family doctor here, and the one that we had where we lived before, the one where we live now, he's also a certified homeopath.
Oh, that's excellent. Oh, that's good.
So he combines that. So his first reaction is, he always tells my wife, "I'm not giving you a pill unless I have to."
Oh, excellent.
That's where he starts. Okay, and
yeah.
The one in where we lived before, he although he wasn't certified in that direction, he hadn't taken any training in that direction. That was his general attitude, because he took over the practice there. He married the daughter of the doctor who was there.
Oh, okay.
So he and his wife are both doctors, and so now they both run the practice. And their father, who died recently, was the guy who was our physician there. And he was about my age, or our age, I guess. He was born about 48, 49. And he was old school medicine. Mm-hmm. So when I had a daughter that came down with salmonella, and we were all over the place doing things, and he had worked with the. It seems to be a common ailment amongst stewardesses and people who do long flights that are on airplanes a lot. And so he worked with the people in Frankfurt on therapies for this kind of thing, and they got rid of it because it can be. You have to do tests because it can be that it becomes permanent, and you have to be certified, because you can't work like in food services or anything anymore. So you get, paperwork. He developed therapies that eliminated it within weeks. And so and none of it involved chemicals.
That's
it involved things like sauerkraut and and normal foods and slight changes of diet. And it's too bad. It's too bad that so many doctors these days, they go through this training and they do know a lot. I agree. Your characterization was perfect, mechanic. But you need to be a doctor. You need to engage the person who's sitting there.
A bedside manner.
Bedside manner. I mean, I've told you before, our current doctor was a doctor he was a military doctor. That was what he liked to do. So he still has that military manner. So, which is a little hard for some people to take. But his fundamental philosophy is, we'll do the pills last. There's got to be another way to handle this, and see if we can do that. And so he always gives because my wife's borderline. It's a matter of, do we go to a pill?
And that's what I am.
Why when you were saying this, I'm going, sounds familiar. I've heard this before. That's why I was kind of
Yeah.
interested in how that was going to turn out. So,
Yeah, it was a work in progress as far as establish a relationship. This
Yeah.
is only the second time.
yeah, that's all.
And I just come at it, and I know the obstacles I have to go
Yeah.
through is it's more or less, you know, it's a famous phrase that I use with a lot of people, but especially with professional. I'm going to teach you how I want to be treated.
Yeah, it's a long road to hoe.
Yeah, it is, but interesting, and we got to get in the conversation. But interesting that something's this morning. I woke up of understanding why I'm so fanatic about this, and it just for try to keep it simple. But it was something my unconscious revealed to me that I think I've revealed that on this site that. You know, I was 10 years old when I was operated on. I
Yeah.
didn't have a voice in that.
Right.
And I yesterday I heard that 10-year-old with my adult going, this isn't gonna, it's gonna work a different way this time.
Yeah.
So it was an interesting experience with my unconscious saying, you got this, relax, you got this.
Yeah. Sometimes you just have to persevere.
Yeah, exactly, that's true. Anyway.
Okay. All right, good. Glad to hear it. Hi, guys.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Doug.
Hello. Say, I don't know what you're talking about, Michael, but it sounds invasive.
We don't know. We don't know either. No, Michael always knows what he's talking about.
I had to go to the doctor about my my borderline diabetes, and there's some important things, but I had to deal with the doctor's way of me dealing with it and the way I'm choosing to deal with it. It's that rub. So I respect doctors' knowledge, but guess what? I've lived in this body a long time, and you know nothing about it.
It's kind of something we've talked about on the site multiple times is, well, this one way of viewing things versus opening up to possibilities, and not saying anything about all doctors, but
No.
The general default of doctor is fix, cure, and save before listening, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm how do I put this now? I'm embracing the artist within me of having multiple views, and they're going to listen to me. Damn it. Anyway,
anything that wants to be said before I'll do a very brief, loose introduction, and I think the conversation will open up on its own as it does to something great and wondrous, or useful.
Let's do it, Doug.
Yep.
Let's do it.
Yep.
Go for it.
Go for it.
Light the dynamite.
The curtain is rising.
Yeah, the curtain is rising.
The spotlight is on you.
I'm half naked right now.
But no pressure, Doug. No pressure.
No pressure. No pressure.
I've got my coffee in hand. Everything's good to go here. No, I was reflecting on reading, and I didn't get to attend I think it was on Words, but at the end, everybody said their top 5 favorite books, or at least favorite books they could think of at the moment. And that's not what I'm going to do here, but there was a loose framing of thinking about what you're reading as you go about your day. It was posted on a Thursday or Friday, and usually on the weekends we frequent away from the site as we jump into whatever is occurring in our own lives. But I took it upon myself to take a little time to focus on where my body was, or how I was reading over the weekend. And just like our thoughts here, or maybe my thoughts in general, that I was all over the place. I recently had a chance to go to Knoxville, Tennessee, where I grew up, and there's a huge warehouse now McKay's used bookstore, which used to be just kind of a hole in the wall, trade in a book and buy a book type of place. And it's really expanded into a 2-story warehouse with a constant flow of intake of books and everything. But I had a chance to browse there. It's one of my favorite places to go. I don't have what Johnny has in New York of great used or esoteric type of bookstores that I can sit down and frequent here in Kentucky. But I picked up a copy of William Connolly's World of Becoming. So that was my physical book for the weekend, and I took that with me in bed. I had it in the house when I was sitting on a couch. I pace when I read, so I had it while I was walking around. But I realized I was doing so much other type of reading. There was the unfortunate, at least for me, occurrence where we have my father-in-law working, so I'm spending an hour in the evening and an hour in the morning taking him to work and picking him up. I'm taking one for the team, I suppose, right now, while we figure out exactly what's going to happen. But during that time, well, I'll communicate with him. That's our chance I learn Tagalog, he learns English, and we try to have a decent conversation. But after he leaves, I have a device that reads to me. And so I think Johnny mentioned Timothy Morton's book, Being Ecological. So I got a copy of that. I've been listening to it online or on my device. So I'm not actually reading, but I'm receiving a reading. It's a book that was written. So what does that mean? And I'm not looking at any of the words. I'm paying attention to what I'm doing when I'm driving. So essentially this is an audiobook. But that's still a type of reading. And I'm absorbing that material. And it's different. It's not better or worse, or perhaps you can dig down deep and say, well, we've lost something, or well, we're actually gaining something from it. But no, I enjoyed that I could do something else and still access the reading. And then there's the online forum that we pay attention to. That's another type of reading that's kind of bite-sized pieces sometimes. And when we do the reading, we also spend a good amount of time thinking of a response, allowing ourselves to take in, this is more of the communal aspect of reading. We read each other through our post on the forum. Some of us might be writing books in the background, or perhaps a forum post might be a chapter from a book or an essay we wrote. But most of it is a conversation that we're having with each other. But we're reading and we're looking online, or however you might be observing this forum. So reading has changed from when I was a child. I know I was only reading books or listening to somebody read to me. And it's very, very interesting how all this pieces together. I've also read financial documents. I've read billboards. I read whatever is going on all around me. So what exactly is reading? But when I tried to focus on the body, I still had difficulty placing my body, and other than, well, yeah, I'm here. Okay, I'm on the couch. Okay, I'm in the car. But it's hard to recognize the body while you're reading, unless you're actually doing some sort of focus, or this is personal experience perhaps, but just maybe getting into some sort of meditative state where you can observe the body. And I did like what Andrew posted. I read the forum post for this thread while I was at the library with my son when he was reading books. And I wasn't in the adult section. I didn't have anything else with me, and he was wanting to be alone reading. So I got out my phone and I could read the post, but I wasn't fully focused on what was being said. So I reviewed it a little bit before I came on here. And I really like the discussion that was expressed there, and perhaps we can continue in that direction. And what Andrew was talking about, the intensity of the reading experience. I forget the exact term he used. Don't have the form and post in front of me right now, but he's talking about how absorbed we are within our reading or in the book. That's a way for us to embody the reading or allow the writing or the book to be read or to speak to us. So that's a direction we could go in as well. So I think I'll stop there and open it up. If we need a prompt, then yeah, simply state what you've been reading. But I don't think we even need a prompt like that.
So I'll jump in here. And like you, Doug, I've been all over the place of using this frame of reading and the body all weekend, like you suggested. It's actually what you suggested is something I just have come to do as part of my embodiment. Is if I could start this way, I consider reading a physical act from the bottom up, in the sense that reading is an act of noticing that you can feel the body doing in terms of paying attention. If you're paying attention or giving attention, the body is reading the environment, both outside itself and within itself. And that is instinctual. And I've come to embrace that, giving attention to that instinctual type of reading / noticing what's happening. And as I've done that, then we make larger our focus, hopefully with a balance of alertness and relaxation, in terms of, okay, now I'm reading a book. It has words on the page. And what I pay attention when I'm reading a book specifically, and I was reading a book in the wake of trauma, psychology and philosophy for those that suffer. And the words that came off the page and how I paid attention, like he says, of how my eyes might be trying to focus in on a sentence on a page. Or one of the things that comes up for me, because I think because of my condition of chronic pain, is the micro muscular things that happen if I sit in one position too long. I sense there is a layer of how I'm actually working with the words and digesting the ideas and thoughts that's coming across. So sometimes when I notice that, it's good for me to get up and loosen, because I think that think and feel that I've contracted, in a sense, not just mental rationally, but there's this link, intertwingling between my muscles and my thought process. And this is a learned skill. I don't want to. It's not micromanaging, but when you first learn it, it feels that way. But it's more or less that alert, relaxed possibility when you're interacting with a book. But also, I I read I just acknowledge I'm reading my environment all the time when I walk through the day, because I interact with so many different people, homeless. Especially with the homeless, when I see somebody on the street and I notice it, I'm reading the effect it has on me to see somebody laying in the street, and in that destitute, it affects me. But I have to pay attention. It may not be the best action to do anything. You know, I have on occasion with that situation gone up and very cautiously tried to make sure they're alive, because sometimes something in me, an instinct, I need to check that out. Now, fortunately, I have not had that happen to me in 23 years, other than when I was walking across a parking lot, the doors were open in a car and somebody had been shot. And I was the first person on the scene and had to call the cops. So this is where my experience of reading expands up from my feet, through the body and out my eyes, and it actually goes both ways. So I'm just going to stop there as far as sharing my experience of reading in terms with the body, whether it's a book or in any other ways. I think it's an activity that is online, like breathing, that we need to bring some good quality attention to.
Well, sex is universal, right? But how we express sex is going to be culturally influenced. If not, our sex lives are often dominated by culture.
Yeah.
And how it can be expressed and with whom is not arbitrary. And there are very harsh penalties in our society for people who get confused. And those penalties are getting harsher as we look at some of the scandals that have been happening recently. Anyway, I'm just bringing that up because when we're reading, we sort of think we're going into a private space of our own choosing, because we chose the book we want to read, or if we're watching a movie, or we're listening to written speech. As Doug was doing in his car, he was listening to a text that was being read, which is different from listening to people talking on the radio. Or you could be in a car, on a couch reading a hard copy of something, or gazing into your laptop reading something. So these are all very different kinds of ways of entering into the reading experience. Also, you mentioned, Michael, the physical act of reading and the bottoms-up nature of it, and how you broaden, open your focus. And you talked about the wake of trauma, and how alert, relaxed possibility. And you sort of looked at you're reading an environment, walking down the street and you see someone, a destitute person, and that has an effect, you said, upon you. So it seems like you can read books and you can also read people, you can read environments. So I'm just curious about the perceiver. Where is the perceiver? I think we talk a lot about the body. The title I think you've chosen is Reading and the Body. My question is, which body? And I have a big question about the perceiver, and where is the perceiver, and what kind of perceiver? Does that perceiver have a size or a shape? That's very different from the body. Sitting on a couch, looking into the laptop, or driving in a car and listening to written speech, or listening to a talk. And I'm just going to quote someone I'm reading right now, Alve Noe. He's a perceptual, he writes a lot, he's a philosopher of perception actually, but I think he said some interesting things about talking. Talking is something that we do with others. We move our mouths and our throats, and we modulate our breath and rhythms, our posture and our orientation. Talking has more in common with free play, soccer ball, or dancing than with sentences printed on a page. And how do you write movement down? Choreographers have tried and failed to do this. He says talking is an ongoing transaction, a negotiation. He goes on to make the claim there is no writing without talking. He also adds, there is no talking without writing. So he's very interested in the speech and writing and how they are, from his view, entangled. And I find this very suggestive. And I just want to briefly show you a little, this is an exercise. You can participate with me if you like. It's very simple. I want you to read this silently. And now you can voice it. Just voice the consonants. Ta, ba, ra, n, ta, ba. Then you can voice the vowels. U, I, O, A, U, I. And then you can bring it all together. To be or not to be. That famous beginning of a very famous soliloquy that we all know and love. So this is what I'm curious about. Is this relationship between sound and sense and perceiver and voice and speech and writing. Because it's there's a whole lot of overlaps. And I also wanted to, and if you think about some meditation practices, it's an old Tibetan practice that I've used a lot. It's working with different sounds and where they emanate from your body. So an L sound, you can feel it vibrating your pelvis. A V sound, if you prolong it enough, you'll start feeling the viscera around your navel start to vibrate. The R sound, it'll come up into the solar plexus. I'm just overviewing this very quickly. The ha, ah, you can feel it vibrating the chest. Oh, you can feel that in the throat. You can feel it up in the head. So you can work with these different sounds, moving up and down from your lower torso to the higher centers in your head. And also other people can sense this as well. People are picking up on vibratory patterns that are emanating from the speaking body or the speaking bodies around you. If you're in a crowded space and you may not hear the words that people are using, but you can hear the sounds and the quality of the sounds that are emanating through and between their bodies in communication. So see, these are some of the questions that I'm asking. And this was a very big topic and a very difficult one for me. I actually went over and reviewed that video that you posted with yourself, Doug, and TJ, and myself, working with Reading at Your Best, and working on the different metaphors that came to us. But I'll also, just to close, I remember, perhaps this is a very big dilemma, paradox for me. I remember I was in a hypnosis class. This was a moment that was very pivotal. There was a before and an after this event. Before this event, I think I was a little weird, a little odd perhaps, but pretty much centered in a very conventional worldview. After this event, I was very weird. I was very different. And I was noticing things that I had never noticed before. Not that they were all, I was swimming around in this admixtures of perceiver and perceiving and percepts and concepts, just as everybody else. But I just started to tune into this kind of phenomena in very different ways. But I had, in this hypnosis class, I had a very vivid recall. And they were basically taking, I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again because it sort of brings forward some of the paradox. I was moving from my adult age, I think I was in my late 20s, maybe early 30s, through the past, looking at certain periods of the past where there were positive learning experiences. This was the design of this exercise. So the hypnotist, the student hypnotist, we're all studying hypnosis, was speaking in a certain tone of voice, paying attention to my breathing, entering into a rhythm with me, my physiology, and paying very exquisite attention to very subtle sensory cues. So this is part of the technique of any good hypnotist or meditation practitioner. Or if you've ever led meditation, you know about how to match another's physiology and enter into the weave of that person's experience with your voice. So anyway, I was being led by somebody very extremely well, because I found myself, they said, I think it was 15. And all of a sudden, I was surprised. And I said out loud, I was in a trance state, but I was perfectly able to speak. I said, oh, my right leg, it doesn't move. Huh. And I tried to move it and it didn't move. So it was a strange mixture of the conscious 30-year-old with the presence of the physiology of the 15-year-old, for I had indeed been paralyzed in my right leg when I was 15. From the ages of, I think it was between 12 and 15, I was paralyzed due to an accident. But I noticed that this caused a bit of the affective tone of the person who was leading me. They got thrown off by this, because they did not think, I imagined that they imagined that being paralyzed was not a positive learning experience for anyone. So they were genuinely concerned for the ecology of my well-being, and I appreciated that. But I let them know that it was okay. And I started to download thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of deep reading. I read every fucking book on the planet in those 3 years, because I couldn't dance, I couldn't run, I couldn't play basketball, I couldn't play football, I couldn't do any of the other things my peers were doing. And the only thing that I was able to manage physical pain with was my imagination. And I read Dostoevsky, I read Tolstoy, I read Shakespeare, I read just about everything, not knowing that these were supposed to be very difficult books that were for advanced readers, because I had no idea. You know, so I was reading Thomas Mann and everybody, as well as reading some bestsellers like Gone with the Wind, very indiscriminately and without any guidance. I just took a very deep dive. And then she said, go right before the accident happened. And that was when I was 13. And as soon as I hit 13, before the accident, I moved my right leg. And I felt it was fine. So I just thought that was a very traumatic learning for me, to realize that there's all kinds of what the conscious and the unconscious and the cognitive non-conscious, which is a lot of thinkers are thinking about this, how we can decouple from the perceptual system, and we can learn things, and then we can recouple with the perceptual system. And this is basically, I think, what dreaming is, and I think it's what the imagination does. And this sort of set in motion a tremendously accelerated research project for me, which I actually only feel like I'm just getting started on. Here I'm in my mid-60s, and I'm just starting to get a handle on some of this. But at any rate, I thank you, Doug, and thank all of you for sort of opening this up for a cafe. I do think it's very ambitious to do this in a cafe because there's so many different ways you could go with this. So that's just a beginning for me. So I'm looking forward to what may happen next in this conversation. So thank you all.
John, can I check in with you for a minute on what I heard? I noticed the senses that you spoke to were sight and hearing, right? Were the main ones. I don't know if I heard, I don't know. I didn't know if you touched into the sense of touch, and that's coming from Kearney of how that sense has been hijacked from hearing and sight in a way, through his teachings with Ehlers Charles. So I guess I didn't hear you say touch. So was that
I think that, oh yeah. I think we should not assume because what someone says doesn't match with our biases, our preferences. There's tons of kinesthetic information I could go into. But it's sort of like, that's not where I was going with this.
Okay, well, that's why I asked. That's why I asked, because my next question is, accordingly, is then how could you maybe stretch out how you interlink kinesthetics or sense of touch with perceiving?
Well, that's the big question, because where are you perceiving this information from?
Okay.
Is it a first person, second person, or third person?
Okay.
Am I perceiving this through the voice of my mother when she's proud of me? Am I perceiving this from the voice of my father when he's violent? Those are different kinds of affects,
right,
that can be accessed. Now, it depends on, am I doing this in what kind of context am I gathering or perceiving this through? The 12-year-old, the 30-year-old, the person I am in my mid-60s.
right.
There are others who were involved, siblings and parents and teachers and Hamlet and King Lear, fictional characters who had, for me, a huge impact, as well as Madame Curie and Marie Antoinette and Cleopatra and all these great heroines, throughout history who attracted my imagination. But I think there's the kinesthetics. There's primary, and then there's secondary, and then there's tertiary. There's all kinds of interplays between the imaginal, the fantasy, the reverie, the dream, and the guy who's pouring coffee or driving the car. So I think there are physical activities we engage in with ourselves and with others. And then there's these imaginary neurosemantic spaces, which are very much, which could be transcultural in some ways. We can decouple, I believe, from our own primary culture, and we can enter into the life and the times of an imaginary character. And we can revivify. Sometimes we read a fictional account and it can trigger a whole cascade of thought fields.
Right.
We may not have a clear historical account for, but that's the difference, I think, between, and it may be a very superficial difference between like reading history that's chronological and organized with a framework and reading fiction or poetry. So I believe there are many different genres that we read that have different kind of affective zones, and that, you know, and we have different demands upon different kinds of genres. So anyway, I hope that's of use, but I think it's very important that a person may not be reporting on something that they see or hear or feel or taste or touch, but that doesn't mean that's not there. It just means they're not reporting on it. And sometimes you can ask, but sometimes you may want to just respect what they are reporting on. And, you know, it depends on is this a therapy context, a teaching context? Is this a creative writing context? Is this a conversation at a bar context? There are lots of different contexts, and that would influence a great deal if you're in a relational zone with somebody, what you're going to inquire about. Or a context, like right now.
I guess, yeah, and just using this conversation as an example is my imagination is tied to my sensory input of how you're using the words, how, you know, and how you just express it. So, you know, I don't know if I may be expressing not quite, there just seems to be, for me, a dissonance, probably because of me, that imagination and the senses, even though the imagination, I do concur, is larger than the senses, it's that contact point that even in listening to you, you know, even if and respecting that, you know, it's not coming through necessarily, if I understand you right, my particular sensory, you know, I have to respect your sensory way of using words.
Right.
But there's a contact even in that sharing. Sure.
I would say just the tone of voice that a person's using will vibrate certain areas of the body. Yeah.
And I consider that through touch, like Kearney is trying to say, is that touch crosses all the senses. Right. And this is something that you've been really good at showing there, and I think you're pointing to in terms of reading. There are different kinds of touch, and touch is probably the first mediation of this and that, of trying to acknowledge that they're, you know, finding the pattern, I guess, or
I would say I would add non-kinesthetic touch. I'm not reaching over and touching your hand. I can, though, with my voice and an image, and connecting a voice and an image and a rhythm, you may have a sensation. You may have an interior experience of a physical touch, but maybe not. I think synesthesias or overlapping systems, sensory systems, can achieve something very extrasensory, almost perception, almost like a remote viewing experience. The CIA, of course, conducted remote viewing experiments in order to get data on their enemies. And I think that's one way of using that particular skill. But I think writing is another way of using is a remote viewing exercise. Good writing, I think, takes us to another place.
Yeah, and a good writer, I'm going to say this clumsily, a good writer needs a good reader at a certain point. Because if you just read comic books and you go read Shakespeare, I don't know if you're going to get it.
Unless you read a comic book on Shakespeare. First time I read Hamlet was a comic book version of it.
Okay. But you understand what I'm saying is, and this is where I'm trying to tap into this notion of reading and the body's involvement, at least as a contact point to, as a reader, you know, there's been books I've read, I swear to God, my imagination was just so, like, you know, absorbed, like a virtual reality that I was living in. But I know that I'm just acknowledging it had to come through whatever level of sensory experience I've had to connect across.
I just want to add one more thing, and then I'd love to hear from Ed, because I know he has linguistics background and has taught reading, which really interests me. And I don't know, I think this is true. I've been told that children can't start by reading silently. They start by reading,
I think so.
have
Yeah.
to read out loud, and then they
Yeah.
internalize that, and then they
Yes.
can read silently. Because I think some French theorists had this educated, had a brilliant idea that we should just make all the kids start reading out loud. Start reading silently from the very beginning. And they found out that kids couldn't learn to read at all unless they started out loud. So that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
But I'm open to any other variations or new ideas people have about reading and writing and how we acquire this amazing skill.
Well, and speaking of that, just a side note, and then I want Ed to pop in too, but Ursula Le Guin made a very significant comment that reading and writing involve listening. Both. You have to, it's like, it's interesting how she lined it up. Anyway, thank you, John, for responding.
Well, having been referred to more than once, I guess I have to say something. Being the sometimes very narrow-focused person that I am, listening, my daughter usually has an ebook on her headphones when she's cleaning. So she's listened to a lot of books, but she hasn't read a lot of books. I mean, she's read a lot of books because she reads too, but I'm just talking about her cleaning. I don't think that listening to an audiobook has anything to do with reading. I think we have to make that distinction. I love that John opened this up from the perception side. The danger in that, or the risk that we take when we do that, is that we lose sight of the reading part. And what's fascinated me about the topic was the reading part. What does reading, and that this is just now come up at the end here, what does reading actually entail? When the Native Americans are tracking game, or the Bushmen of the Kalahari, or whoever that is, they're reading. They are reading. They're looking at physical phenomena and are combining and interpreting that in a way to give it meaning so that they can pursue a goal, let's say. Just to state it narrowly to begin with. And in essence, when we read a book, newspaper, whatever it is, there are signs, usually black marks on white background, but it can be otherwise, because we can have colored things. But there's some kind of distinguishing marks that we scan over, and out of that, we synthesize something. We combine it and put it together into something. Now, the interesting part about learning to do, our children, I believe, are much happier before they can do that. Once they learn to do, this is a point McLuhan makes in his book, once you learn to do that, a lot goes away. You've really, and it takes a long, long time. I know John can bear me out, and it takes a long, long time, and you have to go through 1,000 back doors to get around to opening yourself up to what it was that you were doing as a child to get away from that. I'm going to call it the reading part. So it is, reading is actually sacred in the true sense of the word. It's both a blessing and a curse at once, as I see it. Because we go through a tremendous, it is an absolutely fascinating process that we can look at scribbles on a piece of paper, just to use one form of it, and make some kind of sense out of it. And one of the reasons that I think we need to read aloud first is because up until that point, everything we've heard has been oral. We don't know how to actually access speech events, although we're also reading our environment, and we're looking at the people around us, we're looking at body language, we're looking at how mummy's face, they're doing all of this stuff, okay? So they've already developed the skills of saying there are physical clues that have meaning I need to decode. And in a sense, even though I hate the word decoding, there is a certain amount of decoding that goes on in this. And it is about decoding. And how do we do that? And being able to hear, and I've also, we'll hear, I know you've all heard this before, there comes a point in every person's reading where you actually hear in your head what you're seeing on the page. And if you ever take a speed reading course, which I have as well, one of the first things they try to instill in you is to stop doing that, to stop what's called subvocalization, because it just slows you down. You can't read any faster than you can talk. And if you want to speed read, you have to be able to overcome that. You have to break through that barrier in some way. So, which can be done, but it's something different that comes out of that when you are vocalizing. I can't begin to imagine how anyone would read a poem, even if they read it silently because they're in a library, how they could possibly read it without vocalizing, you see? But if you're reading the newspaper to find out the latest Trump gaffe, you don't need to. You can literally zip down a column without consciously recognizing any character on the page and come up with sense, which is a whole different kind of phenomenon, because that's how speed reading works. So, the reading part of it, just the mechanics, the technical details involved in extracting meaning from a page is an absolutely interesting phenomenon in and of itself, beyond whatever else we may be doing kinesthetically. Because I was thinking about this over the weekend as well, there are some things I like to read in certain places. When I'm doing a reading for the axial age group, I always do it at my desk. I wouldn't think of taking that book with me on my bike when I go for a ride. It wouldn't happen. I always have a book with me when I go on a ride. And sometimes I read it, sometimes I don't, but it's never that one, because I need other things. When I read the axial age, for example, when I read, I can't read without this. This is my mechanical pencil, okay? Without it, it doesn't happen. Or if I'm reading, let's say, Gapser or something scholarly or academic, I got to have a pencil in my hand. When I was reading the the highlight, your weapon of choice, okay? I'll tell you something, John. The only reason I finally decided on pencils is that you can erase them. And I've gone back over books that I've reread, and I have erased underlines and going, what were you thinking? You know, they got a whole different discussion had come up and a whole different dialogue. But when we do that, we do that. But if I'm sitting there, when I was reading the Sorrows of Young Vera, I didn't have a pencil in my hand. I wouldn't have even thought, even though there's probably quotable phrases all through that book, I would have never thought to have had a pencil in my hand when reading. And I wanted to, and another thing, I'm old school. So you have to have a really fantastic, interesting, mind-boggling, captivating text for me to read it online. Otherwise, I want it on paper. Even if I have to print it out, because I want, I grew up with, you did this on paper, and it's real hard for me to get over that. So I'm a real stickler about that, especially in the online world. I know that there are people who read longer texts online, but those longer texts generally don't extend in the main. I'm not saying this doesn't happen, to say like novel length formats or whatnot. They tend to be shorter, or they can be broken down into smaller segments, because I think it's just physically harder to read online than it is to read off a piece of paper.
The eyesight, the eye coming off of
the eye, yeah, and what you're getting and how it's coming in. But the mere fact that we can we can decode these things and make meaning out of them is interesting. I have to come back to John's exercise for a minute, because he did such a wonderful job of highlighting the vowels and only having the consonants there in black and white. If you read modern Hebrew or the Bible in its original form, all you have are those black letters. You don't know, unless you know what the string is, you don't know how to vocalize it, which means that a Hebrew reader has to read, I believe, much, much slower than an English-speaking reader, because they have to know, and the vowel changes can be very subtle within any given word. I mentioned things like this before. The word dabar means to speak. But the word diber, which is the same consonants but with different vowels, has a very emphatic meaning. So it's like me speaking specifically. It's like saying something important as opposed to just saying something. So when you run across those three letters, let's say, with an ending in a text, do you know which is the emphatic one meant or is the general one meant? So you may have to go over that string 2 or 3 times until you realize or you recognize, or as I like to think, you believe you know what the author was writing. Because it might be one, it might be the other, or he might have left it ambivalent knowing that it is that way as well. And that's something that we, in a different form, in a slightly different way, run into poetry all the time. So, you know, there's this whole act of how do we extract meaning out of physical signs in our environment that I find an absolutely fascinating phenomenon in and of itself. My interest when I was doing my master's here in Germany was, how do you do that in a foreign language? You know, you've kind of learned how to do that in your native language, but you can't take skills that you learned one for one and apply them to the other one, because grammar's different, syntax is different. You know that it's written and you know that it's saying something, but how it's doing that is very different. It's one of the, for example, in German, if you use a relative clause, okay, the man who was walking down the street, that who was walking down the street. In German, you would say the man who down the street was walking. No, actually, you would say the man who was down the street walking was. So you have to put all the verbs at the end. Well, if you're somebody like Hegel that embeds things into whatever it is, it can be that 3 pages later you get the verbs. But somehow you know what's going on until you get those 3 pages. If you're a German speaker, if you're like me, you do a lot of flipping back and forth until you tear pages out of a book, trying to figure out what the meaning is saying. Because it's a whole different way of conceptualizing and extracting. So there are some skills that I've learned in English that I simply can't apply when I'm reading German. I have to slow down, which is why I do like to read in German as well, because it's a much slower process. It's much more laborious than reading English. So that's the reading part of it. But it's never completely divorced from hearing, but it's helpful, I think, when we're talking about one, to kind of divorce it from the other. You know, we need to vocalize, and we do vocalize, and even when we do that, we get this when John will have experienced this in all excruciatingly painful degrees that we could probably imagine, is when you read something aloud, whether it's a speech of something or a text. You know, most people can't do it. You know, I cringe when I see some people get up and they're going to read something to me. Something simple, go to church. And they always like to bring a lay person up out of the congregation to have the gospel read for the day. No, please, sit down. Just let the pastor do it, okay? He kind of knows what it's about. It's going to sound like a Bible text, but when you're going to do it, it's not going to sound like much of anything, because you're to do that, and this is the thing, and I found out, I used to have to read a lot to people in some of the organizations that I was in. You have to scan all the way to the bottom of the page and know what's coming and how it's coming in order to intonate what you're saying in the line up, the third line up on the page. And I'm not saying that I'm great at this. I make a lot of mistakes like everybody else, but you really have to work hard at doing that and to be able to do that so that you can read something in a meaningful way with all of the intonation that is necessary in order to convey what you think, and this is the point, what you think the meaning is in it. Because somebody else can read that text very well and you'll go, that's a whole different text. That's not the one that I read because of how it was vocalized to you. So the act of that person presenting it is what I would be analyzing as the reading part. How does he do that? How does he or she do that? How do they actually bring that across? Not how is it that I'm hearing it? And what do they have to do in order to achieve that kind of an effect? That's where I'm making a distinction. It's relatively arbitrary, but sometimes I think it's helpful just for the, what it is that we're talking about. And reading in and of itself is, just to make a long story short, and I know it's too late to do that, it's an excruciatingly complex phenomenon. And it's, if you ask me, I'll put it in Gapesarian terms so it doesn't sound so weird. It's magic.
Yeah, I agree.
And when we think about it, when you read, when you read Gapeser, that's what it was about. Runes were there. So, if you could spell our English word spell, where does that come from? Why do we say spell?
Two different connotations.
Well, no, it was one. We split it in the meantime. Back then it was to cast a spell. That's what you did. If you knew the runes, if you knew how to say it, if you knew how to write a person's name and speak it, mostly how to speak it, you could control that person. That's the whole principle behind that. That's why we spell things. Germans don't do that. They don't even know what spelling is. They don't even have a word. The letter a word, but that doesn't mean anything. But in English, we still use that word. It's still hidden down there. But it was about casting spells.
Right. But with the creation of the alphabet, we became spellbound with the alphabet, right? It created a kind of spell when we started. What do you want to call it? The alphabet and doing that kind of thing.
Well, yes, that's why. It depends on what part of the world you're in. Okay.
Yes, right. I agree.
Up here where I now live, they used runes, and the only reason they used them is because they were trying to get power. But down in the Middle East, for example, the Phoenicians are credited with creating the modern alphabet. We know as little about the Phoenicians as we know about the alphabet. So the history of the alphabet itself is a fascinating history, and just going through all that, and it's taken on a lot of different forms over the years, of course. But it was an attempt to turn verbal speech into something that you could put down so that it could be passed on, or that others could use it in some way. Now, of course, if you look at Egyptian hieroglyphics, that's a different kind of writing. That's this picture writing, this ideogrammic writing. But what a lot of people don't know is the Egyptians had three kinds of writing. And they also had a hieratic writing, which was their sacred writing, and only the priests knew how to do it. And it was kind of like a shorthand, so they didn't have to draw pictures all the time. So it was I'm going to say a quasi alphabetic kind of writing. And the choice that can be made, you see, we've decided in the Greeks and beyond, because we get most of what we do from the Greeks. Our Western culture history begins with the Greeks. We have letters for both vowels and consonants.
Right.
But all of the Semitic languages don't. They only have consonants. As soon as you get back down to the Middle East, and the Phoenicians had no vowels. They used little, what are called diacritical marks. They put points or a little line below a letter or above a letter or whatnot to give you an indication of how to vocalize whatever it is that you had written down. So the meanings of words lie in the roots of the words, and the root.
Right.
That's why that DBR root has something to do with speaking. And it can all, but it can also mean as a noun. It can mean a matter, an issue, a question. You know, something I told you. It's an idea, a thought. But it all has to do with some kind of word.
So this sounds like we're bringing in a little bit of influence from the actual age of the magic going into the mythical.
Well, in the actual age, if we follow Jaspers and Gapser, that was the transition from mythical to mental.
Oh, okay. With the develop of that kind of
because by that time,
language creating.
Well, by the 500 BC is a really significant date, and it's one that we're looking at there because it is so momentous. And that's where Gapser says, okay, but that's where we went mental in a positive sense of the word. Not going.
Well, I just want to add, and listening to you, I just want to add, I still haven't lost the magic of what you're saying. There's still magic.
I'm glad you say that, Michael, and I'm sure John appreciates that as well, because the whole thing about the integral is not that any of that goes away. It's that we keep it and use it when it's best suited to use it. You see, and there is some, that's why I said reading to this very day is magical. That is a magic.
Right.
I don't think there's any other way to really describe it.
Well, and Belli says nothing is lost, right? That's a theme.
Right, well, exactly. It doesn't go away, but it may change its shape. So you have to use the metaphor of the evening. You may have to read it differently.
Okay.
To recognize that's what you're dealing with. I think John.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to a lot of what has been said, but also, Doug, I wanted to give you a chance to chime in. If something's coming up for you, I'd love to hear it.
So this is magical. Keep going.
Well, I have just in this little example, if you look at this, the O sounds, these O sounds are all different. Oo, aw, ah, oo. So it's the same letter, but they're different sounds that are produced by the voice. And I'm sure there are some rules there, but we don't give a shit about the rules. Speakers are not governed by rules. We use the rules. That's true, but we're not governed by the rules. So I think this is something that we're always wrestling with. And that's why I think Alvin says that talking is like an art form. And we're negotiating and renegotiating, and we're changing our minds, and we're reflecting upon who's the person who's ever used speech and language who has not thought about speech and language. There's no such person. If you've learned how to talk, you've had to think about your talking. And this is ongoing, and probably primarily this is a culture is a living thing. And I just wanted to add something because I'm also reading a book by a philosopher and a psychologist called The Emotional Mind. But they have a little chart here, and I think this is very simple to follow. I hope you can all see it, but it's, they're talking about their different levels. They're top down, and then they're bottom up. And we have those primary processes that are those deep affects. These are usually, I know you don't like the word hardwired, but they're using the word hardwired. And then there's those soft areas where we have grief and fear and play and care and seeking and lust and rage. And these are all secondary processes. And then up top, the neocortex deals with free will, symbols, futures, frames. So it's the interplay of all of these different levels, and the concepts can have a top-down effect, but the affects can have a bottoms-up effect. So it's top-down and bottoms-up. So, and we all are arranged pretty much in a hierarchical way, with our heads on top and our anus on bottom. You know? But we have this, and we're built around a tube, and our mouths. We have mouth feels, our sensations and kinesthetics and proprioception. It's all coming through this somatic and visceral. And then we have the neocortex, which is dealing with symbolism and future and certain kinds of imagination. So, and maps, various theories and meta theories. So it's the interplay of all of these maps and the somatic intelligences. And I believe we have many somatic intelligences that are tuning into a vast field, both physically present and also what's absent. I can, in the heat wave here in Manhattan, think about wintertime next year. You know? So part of me can decouple from my physical environment and go somewhere else and revivify the feeling of putting on a jacket and a scarf on a cold day in February, next February. And that can be a pleasant reminder, like, okay, this heat wave, this too will pass, you know? So I'm just saying that our imaginations can have enormous impacts on our physiology. And we can read a sad story and we can get all choked up and we'll start crying about some fictional character written by I'll never forget, Victor Hugo. I was sitting I was reading Les Miserables, The Miserable. And I remember I just burst into tears at a certain point. I was so overwhelmed affectively. And this was by Victor Hugo, who died a couple hundred years ago, writing about a fictional character somewhere in France, you know. But I was just very aware of how, you know, we can tune in to those rhythms. And we have these immense capacities that can have real, in the present, affects. And I also know, I've seen people, this is a tragic thing to say, but I'm pretty convinced that they were given a diagnosis, that they died of a diagnosis because of the tone of the voice of the physician and the lack of support that the patient had. And I could see this, and we know from psychoneuroimmunology that the immune system can be affected by others around you that do not like you. That can suppress your immune system. This is psychoneuroimmunology. I think it's been around about 30 years that this has been studied, but I think it's very, very important to think about how a lot of what our the poor training and the lack of rapport skills can actually harm patients. And I think there's been a lot of studies on iatrogenic disease. In other words, disease that's been created by the medical establishment itself. And how many people have died because they've been misdiagnosed or given an overdose of some drug or the wrong drug, or someone amputated the wrong limb or taken out a kidney that was fine. I mean, it's just horrifying to think about all the miscommuniques that are happening in our medical establishment. But I don't think it's nearly as bad as some of the quotation of statistics in a very cold, matter-of-fact delivery to someone who's very vulnerable and frightened. And I've seen people, and I think that's like to me, I call that voodoo. They're using a style of delivering information which is not neutral at all, but is actually.
Magic, huh, John?
I'm sorry.
A different kind of magic.
Yes, yes, yes. And I would say the dark's a deficient form of magic, coupled with deficient forms of the rational, is a fatal combination. And of course, there are medical professionals who are brilliant people and who are extremely sensitive. So I'm not trying to look at just the bad actors, but it's kind of frightening. So I sort of made it part of my career to advocate on the behalf of people who could not advocate for themselves. And I just saw how sometimes I supported physicians by they would look at their chart and then they would look at the person and they would order something, tell the nurse to go get something. I said, well, are you sure you need to do that? Maybe you want to think about this, because yesterday I know this person was taking this combination of meds. And the doctor would go, oh, okay. Let me look this up. And they would find out that, there are other specialists who are working with this person and they're not coordinating. You think they're coordinating all this information? No, they're not. You need someone to be there who is aware of all these variables. Unfortunately, most elderly people or people who are very poor, who are being frightened and given a lot of disinformation, they're not able to articulate clearly and adequately what's going on with them to the people who are supposed to be responsible for making intelligent decisions about their care. So I'm sure those of us who are in this, who've helped people during these stressful and chaotic times, it's a real challenge. But I always found metaphor has always helped. Because when someone was really distressed and couldn't put it into words, I said, well, what is it like? And they say, oh, well, it's like this, 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 or this.
Yeah. Right.
But they couldn't tell you what it is, but they could tell you what it's like.
Yeah.
And I always found that sort of created a kind of communication that was very useful for the client, for the patient.
Well, and
they felt liberated because someone had heard them.
Yeah, asking them what it's like, asking them to kind of bring it forth and listen to them is a healing act as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I went through this with my father towards the end of his life, that with all due respect to my sister, I mean, she had the power of attorney and she was dealing with a lot, but sometimes she just told my dad, this is what's going to happen. And because of family dynamics, he wasn't too good. And sometimes I had, like you, I loved, the advocate. I'm going, wait a minute, Kathy, you need to listen to what Dad's saying. You may not like or agree with what he's saying, but don't do to him what you remember him doing to us. I mean, that's where I drew the line. I'm going, that's enough. But speaking of metaphors, I just finished a book that was called Your Body is Your Brain. And on the front page is a picture of a tree with roots and leaves, and then also a DNA, helix combined. And it's interesting because I gave the book to my son because he was coming from really a brainiac kind of thing, and I'm trying to get him to open up and actually, feel into the somaticness, not disconnect from the brain, but let realize the brain, the nervous system runs through the entire body. It may be focused in the brain as far as processing, but that doesn't mean, we conceptualize it that it's in control, but like I posted on the site, my brain thinks it's more wonderful than it is in some senses. But imagination, if I'm open to imagination, I think that helps me enlarge and not get stuck, grasp in a reductionist way. Because as much as I'm a body person, it's not about I want to reduce everything in the body. I just think I'm curious. what is, so there's a mystery in this matter, this body, that includes these other things, perceiver, and these other aspects. And it goes along with Karpel. I was rereading The Flip, where that's where I liked how he was trying to say he's not going to dismiss the material. He just wants them to stop being so anal retentive, you know, in a way.
That's right. And there was something else that Ed said, and what you were just saying. About musical notation, musical thought, and musical notation is different from sentences that we read in a book or a newspaper. And of course, there's also mathematical notation, which is doing something else entirely from music and speech. And so it's the interplay of all of these different kinds of codes. And of course, the analogical is probably the most basic and most powerful compared to all the others, and influential. But I just heard a wonderful, I was with a friend, an opera lover like myself. We were watching this documentary on Birgit Nilsson, famous Swedish soprano, who had a career was winding down the 70s and the 80s. And I didn't get a chance to hear her sing, but it was fascinating watching this documentary because, and everyone who said, they said you couldn't capture her voice on a recording, but when you were in the hall listening to this woman sing, I mean, everybody's body starts to vibrate, you know? And I've seen some singers do this. I've certainly seen some pianists do this. Some musicians can pull this off. So you see that there's something else going on besides just pressing a key on a piano or letting out a certain, I mean, and I know that someone said they were, later in her career, she would always sing in a church. She had her local church and she would go sing on Sundays. And she was sitting, and a very accomplished singer was with her, on stage with her, right next to her. And she said she could barely hear Birgit Nilsson singing, even though she was right next to her. But someone reported later to her, who was sitting out in the hallway, who was sitting out in the hall listening, he said that Birgit's voice was so penetrating that she was the only one that anyone could hear who was out in the hall. So she knew how to direct the sound, you know, through that person sitting up in the top of the gallery. And I think that is magical. But I think I think we're in that the relationship between speech and song is very fluid and dynamic. And as you mentioned, Ed, how someone reading from the Bible, if you're Laurence Olivier, if you've ever heard Laurence Olivier read from the Bible, you've heard the voice of God. I mean, he can say the simplest things from the Bible and you'll get chills up and down your spine. He's just so powerful communicator. But it is, I think, something that there are geniuses like Birgit Nilsson and Laurence Olivier, but I think there are a lot of us, we're all performers, and these are basic skills we can all learn and we can pay attention to. We did our little Cosmos Community Theater where we did a little practice working with the voice and working with Shakespeare. So I believe that these are skills that are communicable, and if you want to learn about it, you can. And I think it has real life effects because you start to think about the world around you in very different ways if you entered into the metaphorical landscape of Shakespeare. It's just a very, has real world effects afterwards that I think are substantial. And I really regret that we don't learn this stuff in our English class. But I found, to my great disappointment, that most of my English teachers were just terrible at reading out loud. They didn't know how to do it. And but it's something that you could easily learn. It's not like impossible. It's not like rocket science. Well, in a certain way, it is like rocket science. But there is that anticipation. You have to be able to think about, where am I going with this text? You know, what are the key words? Where's the direction here? And there's a through line. There's something that's coming through you that's much bigger than you if it's a well-written text that you have to be in alignment with. So anyway, I'm just sharing that with you guys because I think this is a lot of research we could do. And we're all performers and we're all making it up. And I think we should use all the knowledge we have, use all of it well. And we have these unique opportunities here at the cafe and other spaces to like reflect upon our reading and then enter into speech. We're speakers now, we're performing. And it's a very different kind of energy, but it can inform our writing in the forum. And I have made this a personal study, a deeply interesting one about what happens in these speech acts we're doing together, and then what happens in the forums, and what's the interplay between the speech acts that we do in the cafes and in the forums, and when we're in our private library at our desk with our pen or marker, you know, studying a text. So I think that interplay is very interesting, and I'm really glad we're all having the opportunity to play around with this.
I find it interesting, as you mentioned, John, especially with the music. There is a notation. Mathematics is the same way. It's a notation. But when I read an equation, I'm sure it's much different than when John Wheeler read one. You know, and when I see notes on a page when I'm trying to learn a tune on my harmonica, it's certainly not anything like what somebody who actually can play it will do it, or what they can do with it. And it's part of that expression. It's you know, the text itself, if we just go back to, you know, reading or narratives or poetry or whatever, is a guideline. It's just, here are the bare bones, because that's all that's actually there. You know, if it's a music, there's a clef, there's a you know, a timing, a measure, it's, you know, 6/8 or 4/4 or whatever it is, there's a key and whatever. And that, but it's bare bones, and what you do with it, because it's to read it is one thing, and you will get the melody. We know that it goes da 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 da, but it can be a whole different ball game when somebody else plays that, and you go, well, wow, that's a magnificent piece, and it's actually just, you know, a nursery rhyme song, because we can do those, and that being able to let's say put that expression in, as you were pointing out, you know, with the opera singer, is that ability to go beyond just the sign that's there into what the sign is there for. And that's something I agree with you 100%. You can learn how to do that. You may never become an expert, but you can still get past the sign, and you can get deeper into that portrayal or whatever it is. And it is really, it's a tragedy that we all went to school, and it's happening today as well, with our language teachers who never were able to communicate even a little bit of that. All of us got it in spite of all of our English teachers, not because of them. You know, we might have had one along the line somewhere that was thing, but I think in 99 out of 100 cases, we got it in spite of that. We just said, well, wait a minute, there has to be more here than just this. This is boring. And then you realize, you know, a seminal point, a turning point in my life was the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. And I can tell you, if anybody has ever read it, you'll die of boredom before you get to the end if all you're doing is decoding the words on the page. But it can be an exceedingly inspiring book. And I'm not even a big Benjamin Franklin fan. But there's something, there's more there than the words on the page if you're allowed to do that. And a lot of times we're not even allowed to, because the teacher can't. They wouldn't know where we were going with it if we started with it. And so we get shut down on those accounts. It is really too bad, because we're wasting a value. You know, we have the technology. This is the longest standing modern technology that we have. Reading and printing. in books, texts, whether they're online or in paper. And we talk about literacy rates. And when we think about this, the printing press has been around for 500 plus years, and we still only have a literacy rate of about 90%. So, it hasn't even got all the way through yet, let alone what its potential is. That was one of the things I also got from McLuhan. It's kind of sad on the one hand, and I'm glad that we have folks here that are willing to at least kick around. Well, what could we possibly do, or how do we go about that, or we can share with one another how I can see more in that, or how I can bring a little more out of this, so that we can we learn that as well. Just thought.
So I want to introduce personal experience, I think, and maybe bits of memory that occurs when reading or listening. I'm glad you brought up your daughter, Ed, she's listening to an audiobook. She's not reading the audiobook. And I can't be taught, or I'm not very good at receiving teachings, I think, from experts or even professionals. Or I've never, for example, taken a piano lesson, but I love to sit down at a piano and figure things out. I'm maybe an autodidact in that sense. I could try to take lessons and somebody could show me the correct posture, but it's only going to frustrate me, and I have to work at my own pace. I have to learn my own way. I see all the notes there. It's taken me 10, 20 years to learn a few scales, and a few years extra to learn that. I want to get to that point where I can compose in the moment, just like speech is composing in the moment, or writing. I don't write because I want to be able to take this and go and make it appear. But some people have that ability, or sometimes we have that experience, that intensity of experience, that it doesn't have to be the perfect words, but it's the right thing at the right moment, and it's going to stick with you, just like any powerful experience will. And going back to my audiobook of Timothy Morton's Being Ecological, and I also had time, surprisingly, to listen to his Dark Ecology. And I would have had a completely different experience if I had read the book. And he repeats himself quite a bit. So for Dark Ecology, I sped it up to 2 times the speed. And yet I didn't lose anything, or perhaps I gained something else. I gained this environment that he creates in his writing. He's seeking, it's hard to piece together, and I don't necessarily like some of the strange neologisms that he creates. They're not ones I'm going to hold on to, but this environment that he creates in his writing is sort of, it's like a non-fictional, fictional account of the experienced world that we're exploring here on the site, that has been explored in certain science fiction realms, of taking nature as it is perceived as nature and saying, well, that's not what nature is. Nature is, and he dumped it out onto the page, and I heard it. And just the other night, after I had finished the book, I drove past that same area where I remember that experience. I didn't say, oh, there's a tree right here that reminds me of that, but something about, I went back into that zone and I re-experienced that environment that he created. I was so absorbed, and I wasn't reading the book. I wasn't looking at the page. I listened. But I've had those experiences with I was exploring Hermann Hesse, and I remember I really like some of the twists and turns that he does when the character is within a natural environment and experiences an encounter with a peasant or some woman in the street or whatever it might be. Some of those are the most, he paints a great picture during those times in his writing. And But at that time I was reading on my bed or at my desk, and I can visually imagine where I was when I last read that little bit. And the same goes for the EST magician's clean language thing we did with John. And I when I saw myself there and thinking about it now, I can picture myself sitting at that same area, experiencing the same thoughts. And there's this is the imaginal realm. But it's experienced in my body. All these times I'm talking about, I'm becoming animated now. This whole time that perhaps I was trying to focus on the phenomenological account of maybe where my eyes were on the page when I was reading, or my posture, or where I was. That's one way to think of body, as we're saying, and to think of reading. And then there's all this other stuff that's going on. And the same thing happens when I'm dreaming, or I can wake up and I'm not a very experienced dreamer, so I'll have a vague memory. I'll try to write it down in my journal, because I take this stuff seriously at this time, because I want to make those connections with my life. But when I go to the bathroom and lay back down, once I'm in that, I can be laying straight up, but I sleep on my right side. And when I turn to my right side, all of a sudden, I'm right back where I was. I don't know. I'm sure it's been documented as to why that is. Perhaps it's the orientation or the gravity or whatever it might be. But because of that spot, my memory returns. But it's all in the imaginal space. The characters we read in the books. You can think of your favorite character. Probably don't know the exact hair color of that character. You don't know you probably couldn't draw it out. You wouldn't be able to draw their body, even if the author vividly paints exactly where it is. Everybody's image is going to be different. And even our own image might change as the book progresses, of the character or the space. So, yeah, I like where we've gone in the conversation and this multifaceted reading of the word reading. And as we've been talking about, I'd like to, it is good to reflect on how or what we're doing when we're reading, because that gives us a chance to kind of chunk it. Here it is. And I think Johnny said we're decoupling it. We can grasp it, this kind of mimetic learning or whatever it might be termed, and we can examine it and then kind of we'll put back in and relearn or take into account the body as we go about our reading, or find what works best. So, yeah.
Well, I think, Doug, you were talking about the imaginal space and the physical body, and how a physical body, you could turn from your left side to your right side, and all of a sudden you have access to memories of your experience in the imaginal, and that the physical body anchored certain imaginal states. So certainly our bodies can, and how we use our bodies, can access certain affects. And this is something that you learn in acting and sensory motor exercises, and how you can remember an experience, and you can describe seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching of that experience, and certain affects will be revivified. Your physiology can change, and then you can just drop the story that you used to get that affect, and then you can enter into and imagine. You can get your audience to imagine with you certain states, and this is a combination of artifice and high-level, top-down, bottom-up interplays. So we can create states and highly entertaining states or very moving states in ourselves and in our audience. But I think it's interesting that we can we can generate all kinds of states for stuff we don't have words for yet. But our words can be influenced by those affective zones, and we are always updating our vocabularies. That's why, you know, our speech acts and the literature we read and write and the movies we see have such powerful effects upon us, both top down and bottoms up. So I think our gathering together with intentions and the using metaphor and opening up affective zones in a small circle of speaking actors, that I believe can have a generative effect on the larger systems which we are all engaged in. Because my feeling is politics is a trickle up event.
Thank you.
The politicians are going to be the last to get it. When it's widely distributed among the population, some of the politicians are going to say, oh, a little light goes off. And they go, okay, I can get some votes if I change my language and change my affects here. So it goes both ways. But I'm just saying that how we use our imaginations, both creatively and destructively, have enormous impacts. At any rate, I think the observer in a system, the questions that the observer asks can cause the system to change. And that I think is very magical, that what we pay attention to, how we use our attentions collectively changes what we are observing. And that's because we're all participant observers. And I believe if we could do this with intent, we could be moving. I think we're already in a second order culture. We talked about that last time we got together in the axial age. I asked what, for the seminar to be successful for you, the seminar will be like what? I got 4 different metaphors, a prayer, a lighted path, a pilgrimage, telling stories around the fireplace, and a radio. And online, I got another one from who wanted to join us. But anyway, a garment, Jeffrey. It was Jeffrey. He said he thought he heard our talk and he came up with a garment. So you have these different metaphors, which are unique to each of us, but not arbitrary, and it has communicative value. Because I think that when we know what each other's metaphors are, we will be much more creative rather than trying to fight for who gets to decide what the metaphor is going to be. Which I think is basically what our politics right now does, is basically, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, whoever wins gets to decide what the metaphor will be. And that has vast consequences. But I think, for me, the second order culture, that we may be creating opportunities for expressing that, I believe each of us has a metaphor. We can bring our own metaphor forward. And the new organizations, I believe, that are going to thrive are the ones where every participant can bring in their own metaphor. And I believe everyone benefits from that. It benefits me enormously to know that Ed has working with a radio and fine tuning. And Michael is sitting around a campfire telling stories. And TJ, has that lighted path and lights coming at him as well. And the garment that Jeffrey was mentioning, and the prayer that I was mentioning. So I think this is where I find a second order culture could start to be opening up to a third order culture, when we can start doing this on purpose rather than just flying by the seat of our pants. That we're not just doomed to repeating the same old shit over and over again. The doomed and deadly metaphors that, especially the war metaphor, we're all so addicted to in this culture. So it's going to be hard to, I think, redirect our attention without some new metaphors. So anyway, sorry about the feedback. I'm getting a lot of feedback. I don't know where that's coming from. Thanks.
Two things. One, this notion of observer and participant is really important, I think, because one, a lot of people don't consider when they're observing that they're participating, and participants don't really know how to be a good observer. You know, that interplay is to me a certain, if I can put it this way, maturing skill set. And in terms of ever since I've really learned how powerful metaphor can be in terms of how I express myself, but what's been really important too to me is my willingness to really listen to somebody else with metaphor without getting defensive. Doesn't mean I agree with it. I may not like their metaphor, because especially when people talk in war and there's a certain absoluteness to their metaphor, I have an allergy to. And there's a perfect example of that. This morning I was at Augie's, a coffee shop, and a young man that I knew, we struck up a conversation around, of all things, Jesus. And I could tell from listening to him, he was coming from a very, what I would call fundamental conservative, but I was able to kind of, okay, you know, and also not feel like I have to change his metaphor. He has to, but I kind of worked with, where's the common metaphor between us? I think there's that skill of working with, there may be a common metaphor that kind of helps with the two, you know, if you listen. And by the end of the conversation, he wants to talk more about to me, you know, because, and I like this because this is a young person, and I purposely, I know that I make it an intent to be as open as possible. As open as possible. I've learned, don't try to go hog wild, Michael, because that's not good either. Because of opportunities, John, I will put it on the I like your thing. I consider politics from the ground up, grassroots. I'm a 60s child. That's the way I feel it. And I just recently been engaged in a book called The Cultural Politics of Emotion by Sarah Ahmed. And her kind of work of how much emotions affect our social. And a lot of things that we talk about and what you bring to the table, John, is, you know, a very broad awareness of that, you know, of the effective being of trying to bring it back in, not to go the opposite way of denying the intellect, but just, okay, let's include it. And it feels like to me what we're doing is it's a matter of enlarging in a way. And for me, it's more about being open, or where are my limits. I don't give a fuck if I'm going high or low. I need to know, my orientation is always how open and how limited do I need to be when I'm engaging with somebody else's metaphoric language.
Hurling a large turd into a punch bowl.
Well, what else is new, Ed?
I wanted to bring up something that came to me when I first read the topic. There's not really been an opportunity to bring it in up until, and since we're getting close to the end, I thought I'm just going to put it on the table. We don't have to deal with it very much, because it had to do with reading in the body. And my absolute very first reaction to seeing that was, well, that's what blind people do, not visual people, because they have this whole different access to it. And even though I went to great lengths to make a large differentiation between listening and reading, when a blind, especially online, when a blind person engages a web page, that's the only option that they have, because they can't read it, so to speak. So they let it be read. And what I find absolutely mind-bogglingly fascinating is how they can take poorly generated text-to-speech. You know, our computer technology is not very refined in that regard to begin with. And Doug mentioned this as well. When he was reading Darkatology, I just put it on speed 2. You know, you just double the speed because I can still follow because of how he's writing. But I know of some blind people. We encountered this when I was the last course that I did in last degree was about assistive technologies. What do you do with people with disabilities? How do you engage them? How do you include them online? And blind people, for the most part, can listen to things at speeds that simply take my breath away. And they can get what's coming out of that. You know, so there's there's another side to all of this, and it's all body in that regard. I'm going to say it's all body. It's not all body because of mine here, they, and blah, 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 blah. But in relation to what it is that we're doing as everyday normal folks who read this, listen to that, touch this, do that, they're taking a whole different approach and a whole different way of integrating these things together. That it's at least worth noting that it's there, even if it's not something that we can or should or needs to explore at the present time. I just wanted to bring that in from the side, because above and beyond all of that, they're doing what you just said, Michael. You know, they have their own metaphors, they have their own way of saying things, they have their own interactions with one another, and you have to deal with whatever it is that's coming at you, and you have to find some way to mitigate, to augment, to enhance, to inhibit, to whatever that is. You know, we don't want to have a fist fight. I always find it interesting when I'm talking to somebody whose views are probably diametrically opposed to my own. And I find it fascinating when they go, well, we got to meet up again because you're somebody that I can talk to, you know. I just always find that so. How did you come to that conclusion? that conclusion? But a lot of that has to do, I believe, with the fact that we also have to, when we are engaged in speaking to others, just listen to what they have to say. And like you said, we'll figure out, well, what metaphors are they using? How are they coming out? How are they trying to express themselves? And it reveals a lot about who they are and what they're doing. And in all of these areas where there's no right or wrong, well, that increases the chances that we can come into some kind of dialogue with one another so we can figure out what it is that we actually think. You know?
Yeah, and the interesting thing is when I felt there was a disagreement, the way I just said, well, you know, I think differently. You know, I didn't go that aggressiveness. But all this also relates back early on in the conversation that I think that it's just part of us, and this is part of the metaphor I use. It's a matter of tracking or attunement. I mean, I'm tracking just like the hunters, you know, I'm tracking through listening, you know, and I'm
they kind of reading.
Yes, and that's what I'm trying to bring in. But the interesting thing I think that I just want to include, and I'm sure that you would go along with it, it's not just them you're tracking. You have to track your own internal experience because this is what's helped me. A lot of times I wasn't tracking my internal experience of listening non-defensively. I just was fucking vomiting back because I didn't like what they were saying. And I had to learn to undo that, unchallenge that, you know, challenge my own, track my own inner experience. It's kind of like a dual tracking system. It's the way I look at it. But that's why I like the metaphor of a relaxed alertness, you know, because I think, you know, for me, it's very kinetic that the more that's the sign I pay attention to. If my alertness is contracting and getting heavy and tight, then I know I need to back down and go to the restroom and get out of the conversation. Go to the restroom. I got to go to the restroom. I got to go dump a load.
Yeah. I just wanted to briefly state my own metaphor at the moment, which I've been carrying with me. It has been a very wild time for me, lack of sleep. We're weaning the baby right now, so I'm the go-to guy to stop the crying at night, as well as losing sleep because of the morning night transport. So I've tried to take hold of my vital body or the emotional body, knowing that I could easily get pissed off at my routines or completely discombobulated at this point. But I've kind of accepted this. I know it's temporary, just like Andrew's saying with his, if you got a chance to read his post on depression, he's saying, well, I know this is temporary, but I'm in the moment. So how do I make the best of this? What's your experience? And right now I'm in the moment of fluctuation, of change, but I know there's something before me or after this. But at the same time, somehow I'm making the best of it. I'm trying different readings out. I'm trying. I've read more in the past few weeks for whatever reason. I don't know what's happened, but I'm going with the momentum. So my metaphor is, I'm not a tracker in the forest, but I'm on some sort of marathon mission, like the old messengers taking, like, okay, I've got what I want in hand, but I'm not quite at my destination. And well, there's this going on, I'm tired, or, oh, I've got this, but at the same time, I know I have to carry on to get to that point.
Well, Doug, I admire
you know where I'm at this point.
Doug, I admire your commitment to your fatherhood. I admire that.
Like John says, I'm not a father either. I don't want to be a father. That's another, like, I didn't learn. I learned quite a bit from my own father, I'm sure, but he didn't sit there and say, this is what a father does, sir. And it's just a matter of picking up the pieces and going with it. So thank you. I'm not good at receiving positive feedback.
Okay.
But yeah,
Okay.
I do take to heart good.
I'm just going to speak my heart. Speak my
So
heart.
thank you. That's all I wanted to say. And one more thing, I do want to hand off to one of you three, not necessarily the responsibility, but the framing for next week's cafe. So if one of the three of you could do that this time around.
I won't be here. I'm going to be in transit to helping I won't be here for probably 2 weeks because I'm helping my son move to Montana. I'm going to the almost parallel to Ed, I think. I'm going up on the curvature of the earth.
Wow.
Got your own journey there. Well, good luck.
Well, we can always take a break if we need to. I mean, Michael's going out of town, and if you're not available, Doug, we can always, close the cafe for a few weeks.
Push the pause button.
It's the middle of summer. Rather than get into a panic about what we're going to do next week, because I'm also, Ed and I and Michael, and we're already working on the axial age, and I think there's going to be a new series of readings on Savitri and Whitman and Blake. So I think there's going to be a lot of poetry in the next couple of weeks. So I think there'll be a lot of activity going on. So maybe we could take a little pause before unless you want to, keep it open.
I'll leave it open, I think, for even something as simple as technical or feedback for how you want something to go. So if you and Ed say, well, hey, let's think about this, and we just need to voice it rather than type it out. So yeah, I think leaving the line open to whoever wants to come and just leave it whatever.
I don't know. I think I posted something on John Horgan has written an online book. It's available online. And he wrote a book called The End of Science. It was a very popular book. And this new book is online. It's easily available. And he looks at about half a dozen theorists. One of them is Stuart Kaufman, who's a really brilliant man, but he does like a profile, a biographical sort of essay on them, and he also throws in a lot of their theory, and he offers an interview with each of them, a video interview. So it's text and an interview. So I thought, and it's manageable. You can read it in a couple of hours, and you can watch the interview, and you'll have a really, I think, in-depth understanding of some of these thinkers who are, I think, some of them are very worthwhile. Anyway, that's just a possibility. So it's, I think Café should be for light reading. It shouldn't be too deep, but we all want a Goldilocks zone. We don't want it to be too easy, but we don't want it to be too hard.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
Did you post the link, John?
sure. So this has been very enjoyable. Thank you all.
Thank you. Yeah, it has been enjoyable. I'm glad we were able to bring this forth and discuss it. John, I just want to also, you know, ever since we did have that community theater, you have deepened, that experience deepened my connection to my own voice, not just physically, but I was sharing with Ed an experience of working with a period in my life when I was 10 years old. I think I shared, you know, what I shared on the actual age, that I had an experience, I won't go into detail, but I had experience of bringing forth my 10-year-old voice with my adult voice in terms of medical issues. So, and I really feel that part of my, even having the awareness and exercising it came, that Café contributed to it, let's put it that way.
That's good feedback, and we can do more of that too. I think there's something very galvanizing about just taking a text, a small sonnet or whatever, could be something contemporary or something old, like right out of Chaucer even, and you can really just embody that even a little bit. I think it can be extremely creative, and I hope we can do more of that this summer, working with the voice and working with the text. There's something else that reminded me of, oh yeah, age regression. It's a very important technique. I've used a lot of it, is how to go back. And when you had where did all this start? Whatever, if it's a symptom, where did this begin? And if you can locate that and bring to it, rather than reenact it, bring to that former self at whatever age. It could be a voiceless self, but bring to that aspect of yourself that's frozen in time certain resources, and could be certain beings that hold a quality. That's what Jesus was for me. You know, Jesus loves me. I said, I made a quip that Jesus was my first boyfriend. It's true.
Yeah.
Without Jesus, I would not have made it, because he was always there for me. So, and I think that's really important, you know, as we're able to go back and service for the ensemble. We can regress in service of the ensemble. I don't think we should just regress in order just to regress, because you may live in a black hole you can't get out of. And a lot of people do that.
I totally agree with you. And what you just said has the felt sense of what happened to me. Yeah. My approach for my Zen training and centering prayer is not to be a Freudian archaeologist going dig. It's more or less sit at the edge of the conscious and unconscious and not be afraid of them communicating to each other. So that what I described to you just happened because I've trained myself to be receptive and not try to fix everything that happened in my past, because that's just ridiculous. It doesn't serve a healing to try to fix what happened in the past.
That's right. And we also have future selves that
well,
are
and yeah. And so you bring what's the phrase Kearney was using? The phrase is you bring a future to the past.
That's right. That's
right. It's that kind of work, you know, and it's not for everybody, and that's okay.
But we're very fluid.
Yeah.
I think the questions we ask when we're centered and we're open to the field we're going to get some very interesting answers.
Right.
And
Yeah.
we'll respond.
Yeah. It's just, I don't know if you use this metaphor, but we do have to do a little work of creating a new container for ourselves, because part of the trauma thing is the container has been damaged. And actually, I like the metaphor for me. I've built a container by composting all this shit and then put it back into, and it grows new stuff. So it's kind of on the lines of alchemy too.
That's right. So I guess we're about ready to wrap up. Do we have any last remarks anyone want to make?
Yeah, Ed, you got anything to say? Doug, Ed?
Final comments?
No, I'm good, guys. It was a very nice little chat this evening. Much better than I had expected. I will say that quite honestly.
Oh, curmudgeon got something better.
Yeah. John had pointed, it was a huge field and it was, could have gone anywhere, but where it went is good.
That's right.
Well, I'm always happy when the curmudgeon is happy.
And thank you, Doug, for making this happen.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. I really appreciate your work. Thank you very much.
It's very minimal at this point, so.
Yeah,
it's just
but I
simple
can't do it.
Dumping of ideas, and you guys processed it, so.
Okay.
Good conversation.
Okay,
Thanks, guys.
I might comment on the post, but you might not see me around for a little bit. Okay, guys?
Have a
Love you
great-
all. Take care.
Happy
Bye-bye.
trails.
Happy trails.
Next time.
Next time.